There are frozen mummies, dried mummies, Chinese mummies. They're all over the place. They're in the movies. And I never met a mummy I didn't like. This is my world. Come along with me. You'll be glad you did. The pyramids and tombs of Egypt, the greatest engineering projects of the ancient world. Thousands and thousands labored to build them, and they had just one purpose: to protect the mummy of the pharaoh. But there's a mystery here. The Egyptians wrote everything down: business transactions, laundry lists, pornography. But mummification was a closely guarded secret, never recorded. We do know that when the pharaoh died, his body was ferried across the Nile to the embalmer's tent. There, high on a hill, mummification began. We don't really know what happened there, but 25 centuries ago, Herodotus, a Greek tourist, snooped around and wrote down for the first time what he thought were the basics of mummification. As far as we know, throughout the ceremony, sacred verses were chanted to assist the deceased journey to the next world. Accompanied by a priest wearing a jackal-headed mask of Anubis, the god of mummification, the embalmers begin their work. Herodotus tells us the embalmers inserted a tool into the nasal passage and hammered it through to the cranium and removed the brain through the nose. Next, a priest drew a line on the abdomen to show where the internal organs, the source of decay, would be removed. A second man, called the slitter, made an incision with a sharp Ethiopian stone on the mark. Ritual required that the slitter be pelted with stones, for he had defiled a human body. The body is then covered in natron, dehydrating salts, for 35 days. Finally, the venerated one is wrapped in pure white linen. Within the bandages, magical amulets protect the mummy. The last rituals are performed, and the coffin lid is slid in place. The pharaoh is ready for his journey into eternity. But did our Greek tourist get it right? Is this really what happened? He never actually saw a mummification. To really figure out how the Egyptians did it, we need to look at mummies. And Egypt has plenty of them. In the shadow of the Step Pyramid, the Polish expedition has just discovered dozens of mummies. So many of them that Dr. Maria Kaczmarek, the team's physical anthropologist, has decided to unwrap one, something hardly ever done these days. Now this one's going to come under. Today is my lucky day. Her assistant is ill, and Maria has asked me to help her. We mummy people stick together. As a physical anthropologist, Maria's primary interest is in what she can learn from the bones of ancient people. But she's also interested in how mummies are wrapped. And the only way to learn about that is by unwrapping. We do have an unusual mummy, there's no question about it. I hope so. This mummy is a bit of a puzzle.
Wow, it looks like it's a pelvis.
All the mummies that Maria's team have found were wrapped with their arms folded across their chests. Not this one.
And you see, this hand is like that.
The extended thumb?
And the other is like that.
At first, it's a bit disorienting. But we figure it out. One arm has been placed across the chest, and the other is at the mummy's side. The style of wrappings tells us that this mummy is from Egypt's late period, around the time of Christ, when ornate wrappings often covered shoddy mummification techniques. Our mummy is a perfect example of this. It's practically a skeleton. Yep, there's the orbit. You see this black stuff in the mummy? That's resin. The Egyptians poured it in to preserve the mummy. Now, in Persian, the word for a kind of tar-like substance is mummia. So when Persians saw these mummies, they said, mummia, and the word stuck. Maria's mummy was buried near the Step Pyramid, the first pyramid ever built, and the only reason this pyramid was built was to protect the mummy of King Zasser. The Step Pyramid is not only the first pyramid, it's the first stone building in the world. It's amazing for a first try. Every tourist in Egypt sees the Step Pyramid. But let me show you the part that tourists don't see. This is the entrance. We are nowhere near the burial chamber, where the mummy of Zasser and all his treasures were buried. Tomb robbers were pretty sure that a building this large held fantastic wealth, so they would do anything to get at it. But Zasser's architect knew about tomb robbers, so he went to great lengths to keep the thieves out. It's an early game of cops and robbers. Down there, that's where the burial chamber was, way at the bottom, just to make it really difficult. Everybody in Zasser's era was worried about the same thing. But with all the precautions, the huge step pyramid, the deep burial, it didn't stop the robbers. Nothing remains of Zasser's mummy. The greatest pyramid ever built was constructed for King Khufu, and he too was worried about protecting his mummy. So Khufu's architects designed his pyramid to foil robbers. The Grand Gallery inside the Great Pyramid is one of the most amazing architectural achievements of the ancient world. But it was designed for one of the most practical reasons in the world: to stop robbers. The Grand Gallery was filled with huge granite blocks that were going to seal the pyramid after the pharaoh's body and an entire funeral procession had passed over the top of them, with plenty of room to spare. Once the mummy was inside the burial chamber, the workmen slid the granite blocks into the passageway below the Grand Gallery, sealing the mummy and themselves inside. I bet you're wondering what happened to the workmen. Don't worry, they had a secret escape route. And once outside, they sealed the pyramid. Hopefully, forever. But none of the precautions worked, and Khufu's pyramid was robbed in ancient times too. And like Zasser, no trace of his mummy has ever been found. But it wasn't only pharaohs who were mummified. If you had the means to hire the embalmers, you too could achieve immortality. So over the centuries, millions were mummified. But the secret process was never revealed, never committed to papyrus. That's where the detective work comes in. A few years ago, I realized that the only way to really learn how they did it was to actually mummify a human cadaver using ancient tools and techniques. So that's just what I did. There are lots of things to get if you're going to mummify a human, and our first stop is the Cairo Spice Bazaar. There's nothing quite like it. I've been shopping here for years. You want it, they've got it. Need some vulture's testicles or hoopoe's tongue for a magical spell? It's here. How about flea's hearts? I wonder how they extract them. Must be a very small scalpel. But we're after something a little less exotic. Remember in the Bible, what gifts did the three wise men bring to the infant Jesus? Gold was one, but we're after the other two: frankincense and myrrh. My friend has the best frankincense and myrrh available. كم ربع كيلو؟
ربع كيلو 6 جنيه.
6 جنيه؟ ماشي كويس. Yeah. من فين؟
ده من صومال.
من Somalia. He says it comes from Somalia and the Sudan. It's still used in Egypt today. My friend tells me that myrrh is good for the digestion, but I've got another use in mind. You're really supposed to bargain in the bazaars, but I've shopped here so often that we've already established the price. Our next stop is far from the crowded spice bazaar and one of the strangest landscapes in Egypt. You drive through groves of date palms, and then suddenly, you're on the moon. We're at the Wadi Natrun. I'm after something called natron. The Egyptians called it netchery. Godly stuff. This place was key to mummification for the ancient embalmers.
تمام. انت هنا ممكن 10 دقائق بس. شكرا كثير.
Natron is a naturally occurring chemical compound found on the shores of this lake. It's sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium chloride. Basically, just baking soda and table salt. But it was the most important ingredient in mummification. They used it to dehydrate the body. I tend to taste things. I want to make sure I'm getting natron and not just salt. Even harder than getting the natron was bringing 500 pounds of an unidentified white substance through customs at Kennedy Airport. But once home in New York, I had to order one more exotic ingredient. I had my spices, I had my natron, but I was still missing one ingredient. According to ancient texts, the Egyptians used palm wine to wash out the body of the mummy. The only place I could find it was Nigeria, and here it is. It's strange stuff. Read the label. It says, shake well for full nutritional value. Not your ordinary stuff. Take a look at this. It's got big chunks in it. But now that I had my palm wine, I was still missing the crucial ingredient, the body. I had everything I needed for the first human mummification in 2,000 years, except the body. For that, I needed the help of Ron Wade. As a child, Ron mummified a rat as a science project, my kind of kid. Today, as director of Maryland's State Anatomy Board, he provides surgeons with cadavers to work out life-saving procedures. Not only did I get the body, I got something far more important. Ron is a co-worker. But no one had done anything like this in 2,000 years, and neither of us were sure it would work. The plan was to replicate, in every detail, a top-of-the-line ancient mummification, one that would have been used for a king. The first surgical procedure was to remove the brain through the nose. Ron and I inserted a long, straight instrument into the nasal cavity and tapped it till it broke through into the cranium. Then, we took a tool shaped like a bent coat hanger and rotated it in the cranium till the brain was practically liquid, so that when we turned the cadaver over, it ran out the nose. I'm pretty sure that that's how the Egyptians did it. The second surgical procedure was the removal of the internal organs. Herodotus, our Snoopy Greek tourist, says the Egyptians used obsidian for the incision. And I think he was right. When I tried the obsidian blade, it was actually sharper than any scalpel I had ever used. But I think this is well. The abdominal incisions on mummies are small, only about 3 inches. But the liver is a very large organ. Can you get it out through such a small incision? Eventually the liver came out, but it wasn't easy. Now the body had to be dehydrated as quickly as possible. That's where the natron came in. We rinsed the abdominal cavity with our Nigerian palm wine and inserted chunks of incense from the spice bazaar. The body was entirely covered with natron to help dehydrate quickly. But for how long? The Bible gives a clue. It tells us that Jacob died in Egypt and was mourned for 70 days. But the mummification took 40 days. Some of those days were taken up with surgical procedures and the wrapping. So we figured 35 days in natron would be about right. The cadaver was placed in a controlled environment, much like the Valley of the Kings. The temperature was kept constant at about 105 degrees, with the humidity around 25. Did you ever wonder why a mummy looks like it does? Is it the result of the embalming? Or is it the result of 3,000 years in a tomb? No one knew, but our experiment would settle that. When we returned and began removing the natron, which had caked solid, the mummy's hand emerged first. And as the rest of the body became visible, it was remarkable how much like an ancient Egyptian mummy it looked. Now we knew it was the result of embalming that made a mummy appear as it does, not the thousands of years. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The mummy still had a little moisture in it. We could feel it in the larger muscles. Was the 35 days not enough time? We decided to put the mummy back in the tomb to dehydrate it completely. More than a month later, when we began the final wrapping, we got the surprise. Ron and I had decided to wrap it like a royal mummy, with the hands crossed over the chest. But we couldn't do it. The totally dehydrated mummy was too stiff.
The shoulder's gotta come up.
It's cracking, right?
Yeah, that's the skin cracking. Try the other one.
That's why the embalmers took the body out of natron after 35 days. The mummy was mostly dehydrated, so it wouldn't decay, but there was just enough moisture so it could be easily manipulated for wrapping. While we were doing it, it was more a surgical procedure. We weren't emotionally involved, we were just doing the job. But seeing the mummy and seeing that it really looked like a mummy, that was really quite something. We didn't just get a mummy. We obtained a lot of information about tools and surgical techniques used in ancient Egyptian mummification. But the project isn't over. Today, friends at St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, PA, are using cutting-edge technology designed for living patients to CAT scan the mummy Ron Wade and I made.
Just so we have it.
Okay.
A CAT scan is a series of thin X-rays that can be manipulated by a computer.
And now we can actually look
At his workstation, John Posh takes the information from the scan and reconstructs the face in 3 dimensions on the screen.
You know, when we went in, we broke through both sides. We just want to see what the damage looks like. We can compare it with an ancient mummy, and then if the ancient mummy looks like our mummy, then we know they went bilaterally.
you know, right, know a lot more.
Posh's space-age scanner allows us to look into the past and figure out how the Egyptians did it. Do the broken nose bones in our mummy look like those in an ancient Egyptian mummy?
Right here, actually, where that little cursor is where they went in through the nose anteriorly and broke right through the skull. And you can see it right here.
Yeah.
We've got a match. Now we know for sure how the Egyptians removed the brain. This is just the beginning of scientific studies on our mummy. He'll be around for a long time, and he doesn't have to worry about tomb robbers. Tomb robbers. That's the only reason we have the Valley of the Kings. Centuries after the pyramids were built, the Egyptians were burying their pharaohs here, in the Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun dies every day, the place of the dead. You see, the later kings of Egypt knew that pyramids didn't do the job. They were all robbed. So here, in this remote spot, the pharaohs hoped their tombs would remain undisturbed. Not far from their tombs, they built their mortuary temples, where priests made offerings for the soul of their dead king, while the mummy rested in the Valley of the Kings. The Valley's the boardwalk and park place of archaeology. The place every excavator wants to land. For centuries, adventurers searched the barren valley for hidden tombs. But no pharaoh's mummy was ever found. Then, in 1881, one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries in history changed all that. Big time. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo is visited by millions of tourists. But there's a quiet corner on the second floor that tourists hardly notice in their rush to see Tutankhamun's treasures. But these mummy cases tell an incredible story. At the end of the 19th century, fabulous antiquities began appearing on the market. Someone had found a royal tomb. An inspector from the Antiquities Service was dispatched from Cairo to locate the tomb before it was completely plundered. a family of local tomb robbers was questioned, and 2 brothers tortured before the location was revealed. A winding path led to the hidden tomb. The Valley of the Kings is just over that ridge. The tomb-robbing brothers led the inspector to this pit, and using ropes, they lowered themselves down. I've always wanted to see this tomb. It's been sealed for decades. Tamam! At the bottom, a tunnel led into the tomb. The inspector could not believe what he saw. Along the walls were coffins containing the mummies of some of the greatest kings of Egypt. There was the mummies of Tutmosis III, the great warrior, Ramses the Great, the pharaoh of the Exodus, and his father, Seti I. But there was more to come.
It's hard to believe that all the coffins came through here. This is a rather cramped space.
A second room held the coffins and mummies of still more kings and queens.
That's a dangerous room. The blocks on the floor there, those are from the ceiling. They fell down.
Thank God the coffins and mummies were discovered before the ceiling fell. How did this convention of royalty come together in one tomb? The answer is robbers. When Egypt began to decline, the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings could no longer be guarded. The pharaoh, Pinagem II, ordered an inventory of the royal tombs and found that nearly all had been robbed. So he had all the remaining mummies gathered together and buried in a secret tomb, where they remained undisturbed for 3,000 years. After their discovery, they were hurriedly taken out of the tomb because the authorities were worried about local people's reaction to losing such great treasures. All the royal mummies were carried down to the Nile, mourned by local women, just as in ancient times. Today, they rest in peace in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Royal mummies are rare, but once in a while, even today, one is found. You'll see. I want to show you the mummy of a queen. This is the excavation of a friend of mine, Dr. Dieter Arnold of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's one of the greatest excavators of our time. We're going into Queen Weret's pyramid. The pyramid was above ground, but her mummy was actually buried 30 feet below it, here in this tomb. Welcome to my day at the office. When the Metropolitan's excavation team opened the tomb, they found the mummy had been ripped apart by tomb robbers and scattered all over the burial chamber. That was the problem with pyramids. They stood out like huge "rob me" signs. But let me show you what's left of Queen Weret. She's in a side chamber in storage.
I want to do a little bit of Mummy 101 with you. I want to show you how much you can learn from a mummy. Even a badly damaged one like this. This is Queen Weret. Now, look at the line over here on the skull. It's very faint. I know you can hardly see it, but that's how you tell how old she was when she died. You see, the cranium is made up of several bones. And when you're young, they kind of knit together like this. They're loose, a little resiliency like shock absorbers. But when you get old, into your 70s, they're tightly knit. And that's Queen Weret. That's why this is so faint. She was in her 70s when she died. Now, let me put the queen back, and I want to show you another bone. I want to show you some bones from her leg and her arm. Now, these are what we call gracile. They are very delicate. What that means is the queen didn't do any work. She had very little muscle, and therefore the bone is very thin. When I imagine Weret, I sort of imagine her, she's a queen, carried around everywhere on a sedan chair. You know, she hardly did anything for herself. I measured these bones, and from these I can figure out that she was about 4'10". which is small by our standards, but it was normal for an ancient Egyptian woman. So I kind of get this image of Weret. She's carried around on a sedan chair, a little bird-like creature. But that's what mummy studies are about, figuring out what ancient people were like.
Remember the Valley of the Kings, Mummy Heaven? This is where the kings of Egypt really spent their money, building incredible tombs. A pharaoh's tomb served two purposes. First, it had to protect the mummy. Remember, the Egyptians believed they were going to get up and go again in the next world, so you would need your body. But the tomb was also a place where you stored all your treasures until it was time to move on to the next world. If you had a lot of stuff, you needed a big tomb. The pharaohs continued work on their tombs until the day they died. I think there was a superstition that if the tomb was completed, the king would die. So almost all the king's tombs are unfinished. That's great, because you can see how a tomb was decorated.
Once they smoothed the wall, the draftsman would come in and put down a red grid. You can see it over here. That was so they could get the proportions right. See, shoulders are a little less than 2 boxes, the head's just 1. Look over here. An apprentice drew in the figure in red. But the master came in and said, nope, it's too big. It's almost the same size as the god. So he came in and drew the smaller figure in black. Finally, when they've got it in black, then the sculptor comes in, and he starts chiseling the wall away around the outline, so you get a nice relief. What's neat about this tomb is you can see just when they stopped. Look over here. The sculptor started to sculpt out these little border figures, and he got to here. And then word reached him. The pharaoh was dead. So 3,000 years ago, he put down his chisel, put down his hammer, walked away, and never came back.
The workmen did finish this wall. It's the Book of the Gates, a kind of guidebook for the dead pharaoh to help him pass through the gates of the 12 hours of the night. A huge snake above the gates protects the mummy before it resurrects. At the end of the tomb was the payoff, the burial chamber. Once this room was packed with treasures, everything a king needed for the next world. Tutankhamun brought his chariots, thrones, and beds. Royal tombs are fantastic, but I really like the tombs of the non-royals. They show what everyday life was like in ancient Egypt. You don't have to go to Egypt to see what the average person wanted to take with them to the next world. The city of Turin, Italy, has an incredible Egyptian museum. It's one of my favorite places. Outside of Egypt, it doesn't get much better than this, and it has a complete tomb of somebody I can identify with.
That's the owner of the tomb over there, Ka. He was an architect. You see him? He's smelling a lotus. And right behind him is his wife, Meret. But look under the chair. Can you see what it is? That's her mirror in the front, and behind it is her makeup. She was going to the next world with her cosmetics. Now, they weren't just going to take cosmetics, they were going to take everything, their furniture. But look over here. This is their game board. They probably played it in the evenings. It's a little bit like backgammon. You'd throw sticks, and that would determine how many pieces you would move, how many squares. And you see behind it? Those are the stools that they sat on when they played it in the evening. It's kind of like they really believed that the next world would be like this one. It was sort of bring your own tennis racket. And over here, that's bread. It's stale by now, but it was their ticket to the next world. These were gifts for the gods. Can you see what's sculpted on that one over there? It's an ear, so the gods would hear their prayers. Going to the next world was kind of like packing for a trip to a place you've never been. So you tried to take everything. Here are their clothes. Take a look at this one over here, this tunic. If you look closely, you can see it's been mended. They really wore them. And over here, that's Ka's laundry mark. He wanted to make sure he got the right shirts back. But let me show you what was probably Ka's favorite object in this world and the next. His cubit stick. Remember, he was an architect. He was going to work in the next world, and he would need this. It was like a yardstick. Now, it's gold. It was given to him by the king for years of devoted service. It's kind of like his gold pocket watch, and he wasn't leaving this world without it.
These things aren't as glitzy as Tutankhamun's, but I can really identify with this stuff. It was kind of cozy in the tomb, filled with all your favorite things. Once, there were thousands of tombs like this one, complete, a little window into an ancient life. But today, the tomb of Kai and Meret is unique. Tomb robbers found almost all the others. What the ancient Egyptians really needed was the mummy's curse.
They mustn't touch it, Effendi. There's a curse upon it.
Oh, bosh.
It means death to whoever breaks that seal.
We can't stop now for a lot of silly native superstition.
I have waited a long time for this moment.
We all know about mummy's curses. An archaeologist opens an ancient tomb, and one by one, the mummy kills the members of the expedition. That's really more Hollywood than Egyptian. There were hardly any real tomb curses in Egypt. Let me show you one of the few real ancient Egyptian tomb curses. Don't be afraid. This is the tomb of Khenti Ka. He was a big deal in his time. He was the vizier, the prime minister. Khenti Ka had lots of titles. My favorite's over here. It's overseer of the secrets. But the curse is over here. Khenti Ka talks about an unauthorized person entering his tomb, and he says, "I shall wring his neck like a bird. I shall cast fear into him." Pretty good, huh? But you know, of the thousands and thousands of tombs in Egypt, this is the only one I've ever seen with a real curse on it. There are no curses in any of the pyramids. There is no curse on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. But the myth of the curse did start there in the 1920s. Soon after the burial chamber was opened, the expedition's benefactor, Lord Carnarvon, died in Cairo from an infected mosquito bite. He's really the only one who died soon after the tomb opening. And we know why he died. But the excavators had given the exclusive story of their discoveries to only one newspaper. So the other reporters, desperate for something to write about, invented the curse of King Tut. Even today, people believe in the mummy's curse. I recently received this email at home in New York. It claims that one of the greatest disasters of the last century was caused by a mummy. According to the email, someone brought back a coffin from Egypt, and soon terrible things began happening to him. To get rid of the coffin, he donated it to the British Museum, where they labeled it number 22542, Priestess of Amun. But soon they were having troubles with the mummy. So they sold it to an American, who shipped it back to the United States. But the ship sank. I bet you can guess the name of the ship. The Titanic. The truth is, there never was a mummy or a coffin lid on the Titanic. Good old 22542 is still in the British Museum, not causing any problems. Or so the curators tell me. Now I've got a mummy trivia question for you. Who made the first mummies? Your clue is, it wasn't the Egyptians. Along the coastline of Chile and Peru, simple fishing communities were creating mummies 3,000 years before Tutankhamun was born. Huge sand dunes plunge down to the Pacific Ocean. It's a dramatic landscape, and it's ideal conditions for mummies. The rich sea life provided plenty of food for ancient coastal communities, and they flourished. The high desert plain provided the ideal dry burial ground, so the bodies were preserved. For more than a century, archaeologists have been uncovering mummies up and down the South American coast. So it was no big news when mummies were discovered on Chile's Chinchorro Beach. For years, they remained just a minor addition to the hordes of South American mummies. But when new techniques for dating ancient artifacts were applied to the Chinchorro mummies, they became the stars of the mummy world. This baby is the first mummy ever made. It's almost 6,000 years old. Think about it. When the pyramids were being built, this mummy was already ancient. But it doesn't look exactly like a mummy, does it? It's more like a statue. I don't think the Chinchorro ever thought it was going to get up and go again in the next world, like the Egyptians did. I think they had something else in mind. They wanted to keep their loved ones with them. So when this little baby died, they mummified it. They took out the internal organs, took the flesh off the bones, and prepared a mummy. Look over here, you can see how they did it. They took vegetable fiber and mud and fashioned the body. They even have a little nose, and the mouth is there, like it's ready to feed. In a sense, they didn't lose their baby. The Chinchorro fashioned the oldest mummies in the world because they wanted to keep old friends and families with them. And one of the newest mummies in the world was created for just the same reason. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, lawyer, founder of the Soviet Communist Party, leader of millions, and one of the best preserved mummies in the world. Lying in his mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square, he's been visited by millions. To the Russians, Lenin was George Washington and Abraham Lincoln all rolled into one. But the last few years of the man who led the Russian Revolution were plagued by illness and dementia. Hardening of the arteries led to uncontrollable fits of laughter, sudden losses of consciousness, and in the end, an inability to speak. Lenin's later years were spent in seclusion at Gorky, his beautiful estate outside of Moscow. Made as comfortable as possible, he was given a telephone with a special loudspeaker to assist his failing hearing. Finally, on a freezing January night, at 6:50, Lenin died. Lenin believed that death was the end. You see, he was a materialist. He didn't believe in life after death or making people into saints. He fully intended to be buried, and that would be it. If Lenin had known what was coming next, he would have been completely astounded. The amazing story of Lenin's mummification begins with a train ride to Moscow. Thousands waited in the bitter cold for a glimpse of the man who had led Russia out of serfdom. So that everyone could see the body, party leaders made the decision to preserve Lenin's body permanently. But I think there was a hidden agenda. I think the idea was to replace religion, which has no place in communism, with Lenin. But it would be a tough job to purge Russia of religion. For centuries, the people had turned to their religion for hope. Russians cherished their rituals with incense and chanting and gilded icons. So instead of their traditions, they would get Comrade Lenin? A suitable building had to be prepared to house Lenin's body, and the Red Army was called in. Working round the clock, in minus 30-degree temperatures to prepare the mausoleum, they were forced to blast the frozen ground. With great pomp, the body of Lenin was carried from the Hall of the Trade Unions to the mausoleum. Look closely at the pallbearers. See the one in the back with the thick black hair? That's Stalin. The body lay in state for nearly 2 months. But even in the freezing Moscow cold, it was beginning to deteriorate. Party members argued over how to preserve it. Some favored freezing, so a special freezer was ordered from Germany, but they couldn't get it operating. They didn't want to dehydrate it, like an Egyptian mummy, because that would shrivel the features. You can't have a raisin for a national icon. On March 20th, 1924, nearly 2 months after Lenin's death, a team of scientists in a secret laboratory like this one began work. They removed Lenin's internal organs, which had started to decompose. Using a process similar to what Lenin's embalmers use today, they immersed the entire body in formaldehyde, a powerful antiseptic that stops tissue breakdown. The body floated for weeks in this solution, with glycerin added to keep elasticity. Placed in his elaborate sarcophagus in his mausoleum, Lenin was forever. When I was in Moscow, Lenin's embalmers showed me something really incredible. It's not far from Lenin's mausoleum, but this was one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets during the Cold War. I'm in a secret room, a room the world doesn't know about. It's the exact proportions of the room in which Lenin's body rests in the mausoleum. And this sarcophagus, it's a double. It's exactly the same. This is where Russian scientists worked out the techniques on other bodies that they were going to use on Lenin. Inside, same conditions, same humidity, same temperature, same lighting. Think about the effort, the expense. That's how important it was to preserve the body of Lenin. Periodically, Lenin goes for a tune-up. I've spoken with his embalmers, But they're not about to give out the recipe for their secret sauce. But I bet one of their secret ingredients is hydrogen peroxide. Lenin's skin is very white. Still, he looks pretty good after being dead for 75 years. With the fall of communism, the laboratory that maintains Lenin's mummy is no longer government supported. The scientists must now be self-supporting. So they offer their services to anyone who wishes to be preserved like Lenin. Sometimes their customers are members of the Russian mafia who've been shot and need the lab's attention to fill in the bullet holes. With the political change in Russia, there is talk of burying Comrade Lenin. After serving as an icon for the Communist Party for decades, he may have to go underground. The party's over. Mummies are incredible. From Egypt to South America, mummies are windows to the past. Our past. Think about it. You can actually look at the face of Ramses the Great, the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus. Or a baby who lived 6,000 years ago. Or you can gaze upon Lenin, a man who changed the world. Mummies are as close to a time machine as we will ever get. We'd better preserve them, or we'll miss the ride.